Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister at Westminster Presbyterian Church in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I'm the moderator of the forum. For more than 40 years, the Town Hall Forum has invited speakers of conscience to address the issues of the day from an ethical perspective. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have moved all our programs online. We look forward to returning to in-person events as soon as it is safe to do so. The Town Hall Forum has always offered its programs as a service to the community, completely free and open to all. That is thanks to the generosity of our supporters. If you are able, we would ask you to consider supporting the forum, which you can do on our website, westminsterforum.org. We're pleased today to welcome Barbara Coombs Lee to the Town Hall Forum to speak on End of Life with Compassion and Choice. We would like to thank the George Family Foundation for co-sponsoring this forum, and we would like to thank our media sponsor, MinnPost. The Town Hall Forum is partnering with MinnPost on their first ever MinnPost Festival, a week of insightful conversations with national and local guests. The virtual festival will take place April 5 through 9 with some terrific speakers, and we encourage you to visit minnpost.com/festival to learn more. Barbara Coombs Lee is the President Emerita and Senior Advisor of Compassion and Choice, the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit focused on expanded choices for patients at the end of life. Her work to expand patients' rights began more than 50 years ago. For 25 years, she worked as a nurse and physician assistant, often caring for terminally ill patients. Over the course of her career, she worked as a private attorney, a healthcare executive, and at the Oregon State Legislature, always focused on how the system can better serve patients, particularly as they consider their own mortality. In 1994, she co-authored the Oregon Death with Dignity Act and served as spokesperson through 2 statewide campaigns to get it passed. In her most recent book, Finish Strong, Putting Your Priorities First at Life's End, Lee offers a guide for a more patient-driven healthcare system that allows for death with dignity. Please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Barbara Coombs Lee.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's an honor to be here, truly, and a pleasure to talk with you. I've been a clinician and an attorney and a policy advocate over the course of my career, and anytime we talk about where that all goes, it's where it all comes from. And it all comes from the awareness, the aha moment when you realize that there's an injustice. And the injustice here is that we have an enormous amount of needless suffering at the end of life. People endure it, their families endure it. Needless suffering, prolonged dying. Sometimes people with something like dementia, you could say they're dying for 10 years as they're lying insensate in a fetal position. And there is vast over-treatment. People are subjected to burdensome, painful, futile treatments and invasive procedures as they near the end of their life. How did we get here? We got here, it was kind of a long road, and it started, the marker I use is the invention of penicillin in the 1940s. And it was the first time that we had an idea that medical technology could be a miracle, that it could take someone on the verge of death and reverse that process. And then from the 40s until the 80s and the 90s, that view, that attitude just became reinforced as one more miraculous technology came on board after another, all kinds of pharmaceutical breakthroughs, all kinds of devices, implantable devices, all kinds of transplantation. And we just became enthralled. And it was very hard to put the brakes on. The awareness on a society level, certainly on a medical organizational level, came in 1995 when there was a very comprehensive study. Many medical institutions were involved. It was called SUPPORT. That's an acronym, SUPPORT. And that study showed that in America, most people die in moderate to severe pain with their wishes ignored. What a wake-up call to the medical establishment it was. And indeed, the medical establishment reacted very robustly, formed all kinds of coalitions and philanthropic coalitions that put, I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of millions of dollars behind the project to reform that, to turn that around. The sad thing is that here we are in 2021, from 1995 to 2021, with all that enormous effort at every level of healthcare in the country, and there's really no evidence that there's been substantial improvement. Benchmarks of quality of care, like ICU admissions in the last 30 days of life, are stuck. They just do not move. As a matter of fact, sometimes they have actually increased. So why is the problem so intransigent? Just as an example, we're likely to experience in our own lives, because half of people over the age of 65, the knee-jerk reaction is there's a terrible emergency, death might be imminent, I'm going to the emergency room. Half of people do go to the emergency room in the last month of their life. Of those, half will die there. Half will die in the hospital, either in the intensive care unit or in an acute care bed. But every survey that has ever been done finds that people don't want to die in the hospital. When asked the question, if you're dying, where would you like that setting to be? No one says the ICU. They say at home, in my home with my loved ones holding me. I want to be hugged. I don't want to be in some technological environment of cold steel and wire and tubes, wire and tubes. Dementia itself has become a much more pressing problem in those 25 years as well. And now a full third of Americans die with dementia. The average time that a person spends in profound dementia, that means virtually insensate, not recognizing loved ones, immobile in bed, is 1 to 3 years. And for many people, that is their worst nightmare. I don't want to be in that state for 1 week, let alone 1 year. My own view of this progression, this kind of historic trajectory, has been, from my perspective, and it started out at the bedside. First as a nurse, my specialty was always acute care, ICUs. I loved emergency rooms. I wanted to be right in there where the action was. And then to law, and then to policy, and then finally to advocacy. But the advocacy is always informed by what I know about the bedside, what I know about the real experience of people, the real attitudes, the real hopes and dreams that people have. And the way that we have comforted people who have lost a loved one, that to me has been kind of a metaphor for people's slightly changing expectations. That is that in the 70s, when this rush of technological wizardry was just coming online, and someone would die in the hospital, there would be a full code, curtains drawn, family excluded, a bevy of people and machines that that activity would sometimes go on for hours. Sometimes it even involved cutting open the chest and the physician reaching into the chest and massaging the heart. Maybe we all saw that on Ben Casey or something. These things practically never worked. But when we went to the family to tell them their loved one had died, we said we did everything possible. And that comforted the family. Come to realize later, doing everything possible was really torture of a dying body, mutilation of the person who was dying, complete ignorance, about who this person was or what they stood for. Nothing about enshrining the person in our memories, only that we did everything. Well, gradually there was a bit of disenchantment with that technological wizardry. Those full codes were exercised a little bit more judiciously. If they failed to elicit any response in, maybe the first 15 minutes or so, they were more likely to be called. And gradually we came to comfort the family also with words that indicated the person died peacefully. I was with your loved one when he died. It was very peaceful at the end. He didn't suffer. That was comforting to family. So that was a change that people, yes, they got everything. No, they died in peace. That too was important. But it was on May 20th, 1994, that I heard the words on the news that for me heralded a completely new era of what the dying experience might mean to individuals and to their families. And that was the day after Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was discharged from the New York hospital, my alma mater, and went home to her apartment on Fifth Avenue to die of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The day after that, her son John Kennedy came out of her apartment to the crowd that was grieving there on Fifth Avenue and said these words: "My mother died with her friends and her family and her books. She died in her own way, on her own terms, and for that we're all very thankful." That was like a light going off in my brain. For that we are thankful. We are thankful that my mom was herself to the end. She didn't lose herself. She didn't suffer through the degradation of her personhood that a long dying process and lots of futile measures might have subjected her to and subjected us to, and perhaps leave us quite traumatized with the vision of our loved ones suffering and us being kind of impotent, kind of incapable of doing anything about it. That's a very traumatic experience for families. Well, with this experience of understanding that technology was not necessarily bringing peaceful deaths, came a study, this seminal study, the support study in 1995. In 1995, the awakening, most people died in moderate to severe pain with their wishes ignored, was so striking to the medical community. The thing that they fell back on, or the thing they turned to, it spurred this effort, nationwide effort, around healthcare directives, advanced directives, powers of attorney for health care. And the idea was that if you filled out these forms, that you would be saved from a traumatic death and your family would be saved from the experience of watching you suffer. It turns out nothing could be further from the truth. It was a false promise. Advanced directives in and of themselves are a false promise. Just filling out some paperwork does practically nothing to keep a person off a conveyor belt of futile, increasingly burdened, increasingly hopeless treatments at the end of life that rob us of our humanity. Because quite frankly, we make those decisions to stay on that conveyor belt ourselves. We sign the consent, we put our hopes in technology, we may pass, I think of it as a conveyor belt, sometimes I also think of it as the LA freeway, that everything's just going so fast and we have to keep up. we have to accept all these technological things. We pass an exit. No, I'm not taking that exit. I'm on the freeway. The papers themselves, still, the evidence is that they themselves do not protect us from an experience that we might consider worse than dying. We might say the quality, the degradation, the pain, the suffering of that, even though it might prolong our lives for a few days or weeks, that the suffering of that is actually worse than death. So that brings us to my book, Finish Strong, that tries to take another approach and say that we need something much broader, much deeper, much more comprehensive than filling out some papers in order to protect ourselves and in order to change society. We need a conversation, and not just one conversation. I'm talking about an ongoing conversation, a way of being in conversation with ourselves about what is the purpose and meaning of our lives and what will that come to in our final years or weeks. How do I validate my values and beliefs? How do I come into my full personhood? What does that mean for the circumstances of my dying? How can I prepare myself? How can mortality inform everything that I do in my life? How can it improve the quality of my conversation with my loved ones? So it's a conversation with ourselves, with our loved ones, and then in society at large. It kind of goes from the individual to the general. My book can't change society. Finish Strong can't change society, but it can help one person at a time, one family at a time. And then hopefully, like kind of ripples, in a pond, we get some kind of a critical mass of people who think about dying differently, who do as Carlos Castaneda, said in the Don Juan books, really do live with death on our shoulder, informing us and who we are. I like a quote from Father Richard Rohr, who has a center that he calls the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico. He says, dying is not extraneous to life. It's part of it. It's part of the mystery. And we do not understand life until we understand death. My belief is that so much of our resistance to understanding death and allowing mortality, an awareness of our mortality to inform our life, comes because we're afraid of suffering, the fear of suffering. And we associate death with suffering so closely that we kind of can't get to pass the suffering to the teacher that's in death, that's in mortality. So with Finish Strong, I hope to change that relationship with dying, to tamp down the fear of suffering, to say these things are controllable. We can be the author of the circumstances of our dying. We can develop new habits, new attitudes that we deploy not just when we get a terminal diagnosis, start right now. The next time we meet with our doctor, start having that conversation. Start having the conversation with our family members. At Compassion and Choices, we talk about Thanksgiving as a great time to sort of break the ice. We say talking turkey over turkey. The family is all gathered. I all want you to think with me about what my last weeks or months might be like. I just want to share with you what my dream is about what it would be like. Just pointing to someone who is severely decompensated, demented, or had a stroke or something and say, don't let me get like that. If I get like that, just shoot me. That is not a conversation. That actually shuts down conversation because nobody is going to shoot anybody. No one has license to intervene in another life like that, and it doesn't give your family anything actually to go by about your values and priorities and how much aggressive treatment you might be willing to accept. Mm-hmm. So hopefully, developing these new attitudes, there are some very concrete steps to take, very concrete questions, concrete kind of exercises, will help people stay off the conveyor belt. If they find themselves on the LA freeway and an exit approaches, people can make the decision, am I ready to take the exit? Has my quality, quantity, balance, scale of life shifted in such a way that I'm now living my worst nightmare or soon to enter it? And when an exit approaches, I would like to take it. It's a book for individual advocacy and empowerment. But as I said, I hope that it has an impact in society. David White, the poet and philosopher, has a great phrase. I love the phrase that the time comes to apprentice ourselves to the great disappearance. And that we might spend the whole second half of our life, our elderhood, apprenticing ourselves to the great disappearance. And he says that the irony is that in doing that, we actually become more visible. And we might become more visible for decades after, because we kind of raise the visibility of our values, raise the visibility of our beliefs, the beliefs we've lived by for our entire lives, the values and beliefs that we hope to pass on as our legacy. We can live those right up to the end. And for the reverberations in greater society, I would say, if society somehow tips that threshold where we all are walking around aware of our impermanence, my hope is that there's a change in consciousness where it matters who we are. It matters what we do. It matters what we say. We never know. Some minor encounter, some passing short conversation might be exactly the thing that encapsulates the purpose of our life. And we may know it at the time, probably not. But if we live our lives knowing that we're mortal, feeling it in our hearts that we're mortal, not afraid of dying, but in conversation with our dying, I'm hoping that maybe it can nudge our nation's spiritual life a little bit too, from a spirituality that is based in rules, it's been based in rules for millennia, to one that's based more in relationship. What is our relationship to ourselves, to our loved ones, to spirit, to the divine? So that's a very sort of grand aspiration for advocacy that is really very one-on-one and personal. So that's just sort of a snapshot of where I see it from the bedside to society at large. And maybe we'll leave it at that and open the conversation.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Westminster Town Hall Forum, and I'm moderator Tim Hart Anderson. Our speaker today is Barbara Coombs Lee, President Emerita of Compassion and Choice. Once again, we'd like to thank our co-sponsor for this event, the George Family Foundation. as well as our media sponsor, MinnPost. We encourage you to check out their upcoming Speakers Festival at minnpost.com/festival. We invite you to join us for our next virtual Town Hall Forum with author and historian Walter Isaacson. He's out with a brand new book called Code Breaker, which tells the story of the gene editing technology CRISPR and one of the scientists, Jennifer Doudna, behind it. Please join us virtually for Walter Isaacson at the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Tuesday, April 20th at westminsterforum.org. We're grateful for this conversation. It's important to all of us. I've heard you in past TED Talks and other times I've listened to you and in your books talk about what, you don't use the word juggernaut, but the sort of juggernaut that is the medical industrial complex and its impact on our ability to engage our mortality. I'm a pastor, and I've for 35 years dealt with people who are trying to face their mortality one way or another. I remember a book by William May called The Physician's Covenant that presented a series of images that drive the medical establishment. They're parents and we're children. They're teachers and we're students. They're warriors and we're problems to attack. They're technicians. And how do we begin to alter those sorts of images that physicians and the medical industrial complex use and are driven by in dealing with us as human beings?
It takes asserting ourselves in our entire personhood every time we have an interchange with the medical community. To not leave ourselves at the door of the exam room, but take ourselves in. Certainly be respectful of medicine and the deep learning and knowledge, the scientific prowess of a physician, of all of medicine, of medical providers in general. But they are not experts on us. We're experts on us. We're experts on the things that give our life meaning. And it helps very much to gives our physician little clues about that, and give physician clues about how we balance the benefits and the burdens of every treatment. Because technology never comes free of a downside. There's a downside to everything. And to be curious about those, be curious about the potential and the limitations of the upside. Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that treatment, doctor. How many people with my condition get cured by that treatment? Oh, no, we're not talking about a cure. We can't cure this. Oh, no cure? Okay, well, how many people have their lives extended with that treatment? Well, about 30% of people have their lives extended by that treatment. Oh, really? 30%, 70% don't. What are some of the side effects of that treatment? Where do I have to go for that treatment? What's the cost of that treatment? Not monetary cost, but the cost in terms of my energy, my time, my distraction from the other things of my life that might be more important, like visiting my grandchildren, reading the books, praying, pursuing my own spiritual endeavors. How much of my life energy is this treatment going to take? And if I am curious enough to ask my doctor those questions, my experience is physicians love patients like that. They love to engage in a dialogue about what this means for you, because, making decisions for people is an awesome, frightening responsibility. Mm-hmm. Physicians are very happy to be the wise advisors.
You've used the phrase, I think it's partner doctor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Could you say more about what you mean when you describe a doctor as a partner?
Right. Someone who doesn't lord it over me. It doesn't have a kind of I know it all and you know nothing kind of an attitude, but sees it as a collaboration. I'm your doctor. I have much to add. I do have all this technology. I have the knowledge. I have the research studies. I can tell you what the upsides and the downsides of this technology are. You, my patient, you interpret that. You see that in the frame of your life, where you are in your life. And therapeutics, particularly what we would call healing in the broader definition. I don't mean healing, curing. I mean healing, getting right with the circle of life. Healing, beginning each day in joy and gratitude. That kind of healing. Healing takes both. It takes whatever medicine has to offer, and it takes what does this mean in your life?
You've used the phrase in your book. I was really intrigued by it, and then, of course, you told stories. That's the wonderful thing about Finish Strong is it's grounded in real people's lives. Die like a doctor.
All right.
Yeah. What do you mean by that phrase?
Doctors, there are some studies that indicate that doctors generally, because they have all this information about the upsides, the potential of invasive treatments and the burdens of them, are less likely to choose grueling, burdensome therapies that make great demands on a weakened, cancer-ridden body with very low likelihood of success, that physicians are much more likely to choose a palliative option, to say, when the opportunity for cure or substantial benefit, when that threshold has been crossed, there's no opportunity, then give me my life back. I will define my priorities. I will accept whatever medicine can do to give me comfort, palliation, hospice. I consider hospice the gold standard of end-of-life care because it's so holistic. That physicians are more likely to do that benefit-burden analysis, to be discerning, and to turn away from aggressive interventions at the end of life and turn to hospice.
There really isn't, in some ways, no more critical ethical issue than what we do when we're faced with mortality. There are obstacles to engaging that question constructively. We've talked about the medical-industrial complex, our own denial of death culturally. What about the religious obstacles? I was dismayed to see that the religious leaders have led the fight against death with dignity across the country. And why is that, and what are you trying to do about it?
I would say not all religious leaders and not all
Thank you very much.
Not
That's
all
good.
denominations.
Yeah.
Because there are some denominations that are more dedicated to enforcing doctrine and more doctrinally, sort of policing their institutions than others. I would say that the firmest expression of that is in the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare that is promulgated by the American Catholic Church and imposed on every Catholic institution, every Catholic hospital, every clinic, every physician who is signed up with a panel of doctors that has a Catholic sponsorship. That's an enormous portion of the American healthcare scene. And there are certain doctrinal dictates in that document that are enforced very strictly. And one of them is the requirement to provide hydration and nutrition irrespective of what the physical and mental condition of the patient might be or what their expression of advanced directive might be. So a person like Terry Schiavo, Nancy Cruzan, some of our kind of the most well-known people who have litigated this, people litigated on their behalf. The position of the Catholic Church would be it doesn't make any difference what Terri Schiavo said about whether she would want to have a feeding tube, whether she would want to be artificially hydrated and fed. It doesn't make any difference that she is so mentally compromised she will never wake up. She will always be insensate. You must feed her. You must provide nutrition and hydration. So that's an example of something that, if you are locked in a Catholic system, you will not have cooperation for declining a feeding tube. Or certainly, more and more people with dementia are saying, not only would I decline a feeding tube, I don't want to get to that point. I want to get to the point where if I have trouble feeding myself by any means, I don't want to be helped. But the broader Catholic doctrine is that human beings are not allowed to intend dying. We are allowed to accept dying as a side effect if we take an action that will decrease suffering. So, for example, very high doses of morphine, palliative sedation, withdrawing a burdensome treatment. But if the patient gets to the point of saying, I want to die, can you help me die? The ethical and religious directives say at that point, providers must withdraw and say, no, I will not help you. I cannot provide comfort, support if you stop eating and drinking on your own. I can't provide support for your air hunger if you stop your ventilation, because I would be conspiring in your intention to die. Well, if we're honest, if we encourage patients to actually have a conversation of integrity, truthfulness, there very often comes a time when patients say, this is it. My life is over. I am ready to die. I am ready to, with gratitude, hand the gift of life back to my God. Mm-hmm. I've done what I can with it. It's time to return the gift. Or as one minister who I know said, we never really were given it. We were loaned it. And we're ready to repay the loan. But that would be forbidden. So I think that doctrine in particular has informed biomedical ethics too much. We need a different doctrine. We need something like a doctrine of ethical intention so that we can intend to advance the time of our death. We can intend to end our life so long as it's done its own ethical way to do that, with awareness, with collegiality, in conversation with our loved ones in a loving, present, prayerful way. That can be done. And we don't need these hard and fast rules. They get in the way, these hard and fast rules. No, if you intend death, that's never okay, and the medical community cannot cooperate. That's just too strict.
Now, in the political and religious conversations about death with dignity, there's also often a conflation of, say, assisted suicide or euthanasia with medical aid in dying, and there's a lot of confusion around these terms. Can you help clarify some of those and what the differences are among them?
Yes, there are enormous differences. And again, the ethical and religious directives are the one that conflates it, because the ethical and religious directives define any act intended to cause death as euthanasia. It's the intention that makes that euthanasia. And euthanasia, in the more modern term, euthanasia is different from medical decision-making, medical aid in dying, in where the authority resides. Medical decision-making, medical aid in dying, the authority resides with the individual patient from beginning to end. It never passes to anyone else. I am in charge of my life as I have lived, the dignity as I have made it, and the personhood which I will assert. Euthanasia is completely different. Euthanasia, someone else has the authority. Someone else is making decisions. Someone else is administering the means of death. So really, the line couldn't be brighter. And the line is there at the decision maker.
Tell us about the impact of COVID on this conversation, death with dignity. You know, we've heard so much about ICUs, for instance, or life-sustaining machinery, the ECMO. Now we know what that is, and we never would have heard about it before. How has COVID affected this conversation?
I think the main way COVID has affected the conversation is it's made us so aware of how bad it is to die alone. Those lonely deaths in the ICUs with these heroic nurses doing everything possible to bring an element of humanity to the deathbed. The use of, iPads and iPhones and a desperate family with their faces pressed against the glass in the ICU. I think it's made us hyper aware of the human need for contact, human need for the company of our loved ones at the time of our passing. For both, for the person who's passing and for the persons who are experiencing the loss. So yes, I think we all feel more vulnerable because to a certain degree COVID seems serendipity. There are so many things that are terminal illnesses that we can say, well, that doesn't apply to us, and give us a little bit of insulation. We don't smoke, or, we don't engage in those dangerous behaviors or whatever. But with COVID, there's a certain amount of just chance. Healthy children get it, and healthy young people also die of it and have their lives ruined by it. There's a certain amount of serendipity. So we all feel vulnerable. And it's more visible. So in a way, I think if there's a little bit of a silver lining in this terrible experience that the world has undergone in the last year, it's that mortality is a little bit closer. We all feel a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit more exposed to mortality, and a little bit more aware of how relationship and love are all that matters.
The polls that are taken on these questions about whether it's do people want to die in a hospital or die at home, or are people supportive of legislation that would support death with dignity, are very much in favor of these things, of dying at home, of death with dignity. Why aren't more states legislating in this direction? I know our own state, Minnesota, has had bills before it for 5 or 6 years. In fact, just in last month, it was reintroduced again at our state house. Why, if the public is in support of this, aren't legislators?
Well, that's it's one level that's a question about politics in our nation, and why do elected officials not act in the best interest of their constituents?
That's a good question.
There are a lot of intervening factors, but you can't deny that in the famous words of Molly Ivins, when you got to dance with the one what brung you, and so often the one what brung politicians to the state houses are not those who have an interest in people realizing their comfort and their dignity and their peace of life.
So what can we as individuals do about this, either politically or the medical establishment? What are the steps we can take for change?
Well, in a state like Minnesota, of course, we've been engaged, Compassionate Choices have been engaged in a multi-year campaign, and it doesn't start in the state house. It starts in living rooms and kitchen tables. It starts with people becoming aware and being comfortable themselves in expressing their desires, being comfortable hearing the stories of people who are who do have a terminal illness, who are thinking about what's my worst nightmare and how might I avoid it, paying attention to those people, letting those people talk, not like shushing them up. And saying that, it's taboo. We don't want to talk about that. Oh, don't talk about that, Mom. You're going to outlive all of us. Well, that just shutting down the conversation doesn't get us anywhere. But really having a robust conversation, and then once people are comfortable with their own values, their own ideas about what's right for them, then we can bring it to the political arena. Because as you said, that public opinion it's not just something that arose recently. Gallup has been polling that question since the 1940s. Should a terminally ill person be able to ask their doctor for medication that would advance the time of their death? A plurality or a wide majority of patients have answered that question yes for decades. For decades. But there are powerful forces, some of them doctrinal, some of them just holding on to power, handing patients, handing regular people that kind of authority over their lives. It feels dangerous. It feels dangerous. It feels like, no, that's too important a question. That's too important a decision for an individual patient to make it. Doctors should be making that decision. No, that's too important a decision for a doctor to make. An individual should make that decision for themselves. That's the proper residence for those kinds of life-defining decisions. From my own spirituality, I think that's what it means to be made in the likeness and image of God. Is that we are living beings, evolving beings, participating in that conversation with divine, participating in our own evolution. That's why human beings are unique. Well, we don't come into the fullness of that authority only to hand it over to scientific, authorities who don't know us and don't know our interests.
One of our church members who was on dialysis for 10 plus years and was in her early 90s when COVID descended upon us. The dialysis center had people coming and going with varying degrees of safety, and she was concerned she would contract COVID and end up in an ICU away from family. So she made the decision to stop dialysis, and her family gathered, and she was told it would be 7 to 10 days, and it was 10 days, and the family was with her every step of the way. She was at home in her bed. We all described it as a good death. And that, I think, is kind of at the heart of what you're talking about here, is making death as good and natural an experience as we can, which is, in a way, about how we live. Yes, completely how we live. And that's what a courageous act for her to take, what courageous conversations she had with her loved ones and her physician. What a grand example of apprenticing herself to the great disappearance, and then living it in such a way that, look how visible she is. Look how visible she became as she disappeared. Mm-hmm. What would you say would be the most important things that an individual could do as they begin to sort of assume agency in the question about their mortality with their family or physician? What are the 1 or 2, 3 things you would recommend?
Well, this is going to sound like a plug, but really there aren't any better tools for that than the tools that are available absolutely free on the Compassion and Choices website. compassionandchoices.org, and there's a tab at the top that says Plan Your Care, and there are just wonderful tools for getting to the heart of things at the beginning. What are your values? What to you is a state worse than death? Where do you fall on the quality-quantity continuum of life? what amount of degradation of quality would you be willing to sacrifice for, or to endure for the sake of additional time? Are there certain things that are important for you to stick around for? So once you kind of get to those values worksheets, and they are particularly important for people with dementia, to think about, to do in the early stages while people are still capable, still mentally capable, but know that this is an irrevocable decline. So very important. And then we move from those values tool sheets to specific tools that actually enshrine those decisions, that actually engage physicians. One of the tools that is one of my favorites, it's a greeting card. It's a greeting card that you can answer a few questions and generate some copy on the greeting card. And it's a greeting card to your doctor. Just to say, you can present it to your longtime doctor, or you can present it to a doctor on your first visit. That says, "Hi, doctor, thank you for taking care of me. I'm so grateful, and I have great faith in your expertise. I'd like you to know a little bit about me. This is how I process information. This is how much I want to know." And, it varies. You can say whatever you want. You can say, "Whatever you do, don't tell me the truth. If it's dire, tell my wife." You can say that in the card. Or you can say, "Just level with me, lay it to me straight, because I like to have all my facts up front." When we were beta testing this tool and sent people in, to their doctors with it, doctors loved it. They loved to have this. They loved to have their patients become real people. They said things like, I started out with patients and now I have a relationship. It gives them permission to be candid and share information. Because the default for physicians is the less bad news, the better. If I can tamp down the bad news, if I can temper it, if I can skew it, if I can maintain hope, that's what I should do. That's my duty. Well, hope is kind of, hope changes. Hope for a cure at the beginning of an illness transforms at the end of the illness into hope for a peaceful passing that leaves a legacy of love for my family. We need to allow people to make that journey of hope, to not die married to the same hope they had a year earlier when they didn't know that much about their illness. So I think candor, curiosity, discernment, all those things are elements of hope.
Speaking of hope, are you've been at this a long time, this struggle for a change in American medical practice and how Americans view their mortality. Are you hopeful as you look ahead into the future? Do you see that change is actually happening around these questions?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm very hopeful. One more state, New Mexico, is just on the verge of passing a medical aid in dying bill, authorizing medical aid in dying in that state. And that's a state that, we first began advocacy, grassroots advocacy, and litigation and legislation. I want to say 15 years ago. So, it takes time, in the grand scheme of the human experience. 15 years isn't really all that long. But I see changes happening all the time. Younger doctors have a completely different attitude, for the most part, about the doctor-physician relationship and pretty much eschew the patriarchy. So yes, I have enormous hope.
Are there examples of other societies who have made these changes already, or who deal with human mortality and the medical establishment in different ways? Countries in Europe, for instance, or
Well, the
Asia,
American relationship with medicine is, it's not a healthy one in so many ways. Our system discriminates against people of color. Our system discriminates against poor people. It has this very peculiar way of thinking about medicine, not as a right, but as a privilege. That's not the case in so many European countries. It's not the case in Canada. It's not the case in the UK. America is kind of unique in how difficult that the disparities, with healthcare. There's so much work to do there. But I think of some ancient cultures actually that were more in tune with the cycle of life and were more informed by mortality. I think of old ancient Celtic spirituality. I think of Native American, the first people. One of the famous, well-known transitions, where the elders would leave the tribe and go to die, in peace, be by themselves. This is the time to die. So, of course, that's not exactly the battle with technology that we have, but it is an older paradigm of thinking about humans in the grand scheme of life that we could use more of.
Your organization, Compassion and Choice, I believe, if I remember correctly, began in the basement of your Unitarian church with some conversations there. The question of our mortality, of course, is deeply spiritual, and the medical establishment often shies away from that dimension of care. Do you find that physicians are willing to go places perhaps around the sacred nature of their work than perhaps they were 10 or 15, 20 years ago?
I think there is a reticence, to impose for physicians, for healthcare workers, to kind of impose their belief system on their patients. But I do think there's a greater awareness and a greater willingness to step back, to the degree they can. How I reference there are religious beliefs being enshrined in rules. There are still these rules, this rule-based religion, a rule-based spirituality that does prevail in medicine. Bioethics is still kind of grounded in the idea there are things that are allowed at the end of life, and there are things that are just we do not allow.
I remember the story in your book, Finish Strong, about I think it was an Orthodox surgeon, perhaps. You was asked if their very sort of closely held, deeply held religious system of ethics, orthodoxy, Judaism, came into play in their care for their patients, and the immediate answer was no.
All right.
Not at all.
Right.
Yeah, the reluctance to impose upon a patient their own practices or understandings.
Right. Not that it doesn't inform. That physician, David Muller, a great man, in my view, inform his own dedication to his craft, his own sense of the sacredness of his work, the holiness of his encounters with patients. He embodies that. Mm-hmm. But that's different, that's what it does in his life. He doesn't expect his religion to be operative in his patient's life.
Mm-hmm. As I kind of have followed Compassion and Choice, the organization you are part of and helped found, what's been key to the success has been, I guess I would say, to person the issue. That is, to humanize questions that often are abstract or sort of distant, but to bring them home to a real person, a real story. We have just a couple more minutes left here. Can you maybe share one of the compelling stories that really had impact on you and perhaps on the movement for death with dignity?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. We've had many, many stories. Probably the single story that has been the most impactful, politically impactful especially, was Brittany Menard. Brittany Menard, a young woman in California, who was dying of glioblastoma. And in the early stages of her treatment, embraced every imaginable technology. Had surgery and radiation and all those kinds of things. Unfortunately, her tumor progressed in spite of that, progressed very rapidly. And she was unique enough. She was a self-determined young woman, amazingly self-determined young woman, to have that courageous conversation with her physicians in California. Doctor, what's in store for me? What will my death look like? And when is it likely to happen? And the answers were very sad answers for her. She went home with those answers and decided that she did not want to succumb to the worst that her disease had in store for her, that she would move to Oregon. She did move to Oregon. She brought her family, her belongings, her household, her dogs. She moved to Oregon. She established care at Oregon Health and Science University. She became eligible for medical aid in dying. She received her medication. And then she, in such an act of altruism and selflessness, said, now how can I help? How can I help other people so they don't have to do what I and my family had to do? And she came to Compassion and Choices and said, I'm willing to be a spokesperson. And she was so beautiful and so charismatic and so self-possessed that she was on the cover of People magazine. She was in all sorts of media venues. A month later, she died, and 100 million people worldwide had seen her image and knew her story. She talked with Governor Brown in California in that interim. She made videos for lobbying legislatures, and she has had an enormous impact with this very simple message. I know I'm dying. I would like to die on my own terms. I don't want to suffer in a way that my disease would make me suffer. I shouldn't have to move. Mm-hmm.
Your using these stories is so effective. You can lay out a study or medical input from analysis of surveys, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, death is about an individual, and how they live, how they die is obviously a question all of us are going to have to face one of these days. And it's been a very effective way to bring this issue to its to the heart of the matter, which is how we live and how we die. Now, Barbara Coombs Lee, we're grateful for your participation in this Westminster Town Hall Forum. Thank you very much for your work and your advocacy, and we'll look forward to seeing where it goes in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to our Westminster Town Hall Forum speaker today, Barbara Coombs Lee. Thanks as well to our co-sponsor for this event, the George Family Foundation, and to our media sponsor, MinnPost. Learn about their upcoming Speakers Festival at minnpost.com/festival. Please join us for our next virtual Westminster Town Hall Forum with author Walter Isaacson on the power and peril of gene editing technology on April 20th at noon on our website, westminsterforum.org. Until then, I'm Tim Hart Anderson. Thank you for joining us.